And so now I'd like to reintroduce you to Ron. I asked him this morning if anything had changed on his bio, and he said, well, he's a little older, but that's really about all. But I'm going to read it to you in any event, just to give you a reminder of his background and why he is so knowledgeable about things along the waterfront. Ron is a longtime member of the National Yacht Club. His father, Alf, past purser of shellbacks and a Class A dinghy sailor and an active keelboat owner. And his grandfather, Herb, was National Yacht Club treasurer for decades and an active keelboat sailor. And he carries the Jenkins name well back in National Yacht Club history. Herb had a wonderful style to deal with all kinds of difficult matters with a deft touch. And so it continues in the family. Ron is an active nature and sailing photographer. When hobbies do not interfere, he works in the technology marketing. In the technological area, Ron is our webmaster. He weekly records the sessions. Well, actually, Graham is recording them now, but Ron certainly does it when we're in person. And then he does upload them to the web. It takes him a day or two to get that done. But for sessions that we do record, and we only record those that are in agreement with the speaker, those that we do record are available on the website. So if you've missed anything, please go to the website and look under the blog. And we can thank Ron for, I think you said, Ron, up to 100 sessions we've got on there now. So a pretty big lot of sessions. And in addition, he loads our schedule and any other pertinent information. In photography, since COVID began, he daily posts an interesting little puzzle of a picture on his Facebook page. And if you're interested in taking a look at that, you have to guess what that photograph is. And he'll let you know if you're right or wrong, but won't give you any other hints. You've got to figure it out yourself. He's an active participant in Waterfront for All, a coalition of groups protecting the Toronto waterfront. Ron's topic today is the marine use strategy, an important element in Waterfront Toronto's vision for creating a more active, safe, and accessible waterfront. It highlights ways we can balance the diverse uses of Toronto's harbor while exploring how we can create opportunities for people to access it more easily and interact with the harbor by water and by land. Today, as I said, is Ron's 10th time speaking to Shellbacks. Please give him a warm and hearty Shellback welcome. Thank you, Ron. It's all yours.
Thanks very much, Diane. I'm hoping everybody can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, good. Let me just start with sharing my screen so you can see what I'm seeing. Today I'm going to be talking about Waterfront Toronto's 2020 Marine Use Strategy Report. Kind of a dry title, but it does concern a lot of things that we do on our boats and in our clubs and so forth. The 2020 Marine Use Strategy Report is actually I guess a redoing is the best way of putting it, of a 2006 report, also called Marine Use Strategy. And it's worth taking a look at that report to see what was going on then and what they were aspiring to achieve and make a bit of an assessment of where we were and where we are. So the Precursor Study was in 2006. We've got 15 years behind us since that report. And in the 2006 plan, one area they looked at was the inner harbor. And their goals in that report were to support existing marine users and activities at harborfront, to find a permanent home for Toronto Brigantine, and to establish a permanent home for the nautical center at Reese Street Slip. And if we evaluate that. I don't think we've really achieved all of that. Toronto Brigantine is a bit itinerant now still. Harbourfront could be stronger, and the nautical center at Reese Street Slip hasn't really changed. It's the kayaks and canoes and so on, and they're crowded in there, and they've been crowded there now for a long time. The second thing in 2006 was the plan for marine uses and facilities when the Yonge Street Precinct Plan is prepared. This centers around the Yonge Street Slip. And the idea is that there would be some sort of integrated planning there, looking at the use of the dock wall by charter boats and the Toronto Island Ferry Terminal. This was where Captain John's restaurant was as well. The redevelopment of the ferry terminal was also in the plan to allow consideration of increased ferry service and service to new locations. Those things haven't happened yet. Maybe one day. In fact, I think maybe before very long. The next thing was to anticipate the ongoing industrial shipping to Redpath. The sugar ships, that continues and is really just sort of a stable thing on the waterfront. Next thing was to incorporate marine uses that complement, activate, and mutually reinforce landside uses of the East Bayfront Precinct Plan. The East Bayfront is that corner of the harbor, the northeast corner, particularly the north shore of that northeast corner. And the idea here was to build additional finger piers for the tour and charter boats. That hasn't happened yet. So that area is in development. The next is to maintain city-side facilities for the marine users located on Toronto Island. There isn't such a thing. The marine users located on Toronto Island just get on their boats, with the exception RCYC's got a parking lot and a small building, but the idea there is also to encourage TEDCO, which I'll describe later, and the Toronto Port Authority to finalize the relocation of the RCYC City Station from the Parliament Street Slip to a location on the south side of the shipping channel west of Cherry Street, and that has happened. So those are the areas in the inner harbor that are described as targets for development in 2006. Some of those things, as you can see, were achieved. A couple were, and some were not. The plan also extended out to the portlands. And the first of these ideas was a small craft launching area and associated amenities in conjunction with the renaturalization of the mouth of the Don River. I've talked about this area of development before. To this point, it hasn't happened, but it will. So I guess the best thing I can say is it doesn't get a check mark or an X. It's going to happen, though. The next is to maximize the use of the Toronto Port Authority's ferry terminal. This is the terminal that is on the east side of the Eastern Gap, right near the entrance into the outer harbor. This was the ferry terminal to go to Rochester, a grand plan that never happened. But the idea here was to maximize its use as an arrival point for international passenger vessels. These are cruise ships, basically. And then also to pursue opportunities to accommodate the docking of cruise ships closer to the downtown core. At this point, there is no cruise ship docking closer to the downtown core. They do use the Port Authority's ferry terminal. And of course, the last couple of years, there hasn't really been any cruise ship visiting in Toronto at all because of COVID. But what we guess we can say is it's sort of a yes and no on that. Also in this is the idea that the Port Authority and TEDCO would facilitate the use of the ship channel for limited recreational boating. That hasn't really happened. So that's sort of a multi-point item there. Some have happened and some haven't. The next is to have a detailed plan for marine uses in all precinct plans prepared in the Portlands district, particularly for Polson and Cousins Keys. Those are the keys on the sort of west side of Cherry Street, you know, where there's a nightclub and a golf driving range and so on. And I would say we don't have a detailed plan for marine uses yet in those areas. Next is to encourage TEDCO and the Toronto Port Authority to relocate the Bayside rowing from their current location potentially to the north side of the turning basin. That hasn't happened yet unless I'm unaware of it. So I'm giving it a no. And then finally, to recognize the value of the existing Atlas crane to marine shipping and consider the relocation of the crane when the Cousins Key Precinct District is redeveloped. This crane, you might remember or recognize, it's a large girderwork silver crane that sits on Cousins Key. Some of you may have seen boats lifted into that crane and so on. That area is now being redone into Villiers Island. The crane will be retained, but more as a historical artifact than as a working crane, because it won't be an industrialized location. But they do have a plan for it to continue using it, maybe more as a historical artifact than anything else. You can see that I've marked the location of that crane in a red dot here in the Portlands. This is the Cousins Key. This is the Polson Key. This map is from the 2006 report. So all of this has changed. We have a Don River now that's going to be flowing around and coming in here. And things will be vastly different. So a lot of the planning in 2006 doesn't really pertain to the Portlands as they exist today, and it will exist in the future. The next thing here is the idea of looking at the outer harbor, recognizing non-motorized recreational boating as a primary activity. I think in a fair way that's true. Encouraging the build out of the outer harbor marina, that has happened. Consideration of a new public boat launch ramp. I don't think there is one there yet, but I will say that for the most part, the outer harbor marina has managed to sort of establish itself in that location. The next is to use the Lake Ontario Park master planning process to create a plan that resolves the long-term location, design, and servicing of facilities for the Outer Harbor Sailing Federation clubs. The Lake Ontario Park concept is basically to look at everything along Cherry Beach and then continuing across through the foot of Leslie Street and over to Ashbridges Bay as all sort of one stretch of parkland. And of course, the Outer Harbor Sailing Federation is in that location, or part of that location. That hasn't happened yet. The Outer Harbor Sailing Federation clubs are established and no changes have happened there. And the next point kind of relates to that too, to use investments in the Portlands to foster the accessibility and feasibility of recreational boating opportunities in the Outer Harbor, including investments in public transit and municipal servicing infrastructure. Those things haven't happened. I mean, the Outer Harbor Sailing Federation, somewhere between, you know, still a campsite and modern popular concepts of a yacht club. You know, it's got the boats of a sailing club, but it hasn't got, you know, the municipal servicing infrastructure, and it hasn't got public transit and so on. Next is also in this idea for the Outer Harbor, and it extends more broadly than the Outer Harbor, but to improve opportunities for recreational fishing, including the provision of appropriate facilities such as fishing piers and fish cleaning stations. As sailors, we don't see the people who do a lot of fishing in the Toronto area, but they're an active group, and I think it's worth considering, you know, people catching salmon in the Humber and and carp along one of the other local rivers. And a reminder here to don't put your goldfish down the toilet when you're done with them, because they do thrive in Lake Ontario on their own. And the next picture I thought was quite remarkable.
Whoa.
This is December. This is just a month ago in the Yonge Street Slip. And this guy caught a 38-inch pike. He's got other fish, not quite this size, but pretty substantial, caught also in that same Yonge Street Slip. You know, I don't know what they were doing, catching food dropped off of Captain John's or what. I don't know how they got that big. Anyway, we sort of think of the lake as a polluted, dead thing, and it's really quite far from that. So the last point there is for the Outer Harbor using Lake Ontario Park Master Plan. The Lake Ontario Park Master Plan, I should probably look at again, but it's kind of been dormant. So many other things have been happening. But so the ferry terminal that for cruise ships is over here. Here's, of course, the Outer Harbor, and the multi-hull, Toronto Multi-Hull Cruising Club is here. Outer Harbor Marina is here. We're all familiar, I think, with the geography here. It hasn't really changed that much between 2006 and 2021, or now 2022. And then the final area of sort of study in this earlier report is the lake and the beaches. And this is to ensure, one of the ideas was to ensure investment in the Western Beaches Watercourse by maximizing the work of the Western Beaches Watercourse Advisory Committee. I don't know if that committee exists. I don't know what they've ever advised, so I can't really comment on that one. Maintaining a public boat launch, though, at Humber Bay and Ashbridges and Marie Curtis Park, those boat launches do exist. Also, maximizing opportunities for access to the water for small non-motorized craft. These are canoes, kayaks, and so on. That sector of boating in Toronto has grown a great deal, but hasn't really had very much development of its infrastructure. A lot of people don't really know where to keep their kayaks, so they don't kayak in Toronto when they might otherwise. Next is to identify opportunities to reconstruct or reconfigure facilities currently used by marine owners. This refers again to that Lake Ontario Park Master Plan and the expansion of the Ashbridges Bay treatment plant. Some of that is happening and some of that is not. I'm not going to go into details about what's happening with the Ashbridges Bay treatment plant, but there are things happening in that area. And another reference again to the Lake Ontario Park Master Plan is talking about dredging in the Coatsworth Cut and Ashbridges Bay. That's going on right now, and it's part of a larger water treatment plan for the city of Toronto that starts actually away up the Don River. And then finally, to identify opportunities to create and improve swimming locations. I don't think much has happened there yet. It looks like a fairly harsh assessment to say so many of these things haven't happened, but really a lot of things have happened that are not in that list from 2006. So we can go into the current report and take a look at what it's talking about. This report is developed, unlike almost anything else in Toronto waterfront planning, as an effort of four broad organizations. Waterfront Toronto, who we previously knew was the Toronto Waterfront Revitalization Corporation, but it's a group of city, province, and federal groups. So they all put money into Waterfront Toronto, and Waterfront Toronto engages in a lot of projects, including this report and a lot of things described in it. This report is also participated in by the City of Toronto, and the City of Toronto's main connections to the waterfront are the Waterfront Secretariat And the Toronto Port Lands Company, that is the Toronto TPLC as of 2009, but previously it was called TEDCO, which was the Toronto Economic Development Corporation, and Build Toronto and Create Toronto. All of these sort of entities are the real estate management branches of the City of Toronto. So when you say the City of Toronto owns land in the Portlands, what it really is the Toronto Portlands Company owns the land as a proxy for the City of Toronto. Then there's Ports Toronto, not to be confused with Waterfront Toronto. Ports Toronto is also technically the Toronto Port Authority, and previously we would all know it as the Toronto Harbor Commission. But when it changed from the Harbor Commission to the Port Authority, it moved from a city organization to a federal organization. Ports Toronto is the agency, the entity that runs the Island Airport and the Toronto Island Marina, some other marinas, and engages in a lot of other activities that are not quite so easily recognized, such as dock wall management, dredging operations, and things like that throughout the waterfront. And then finally, the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. This is a provincial group operating in Toronto, but also outside Toronto and up the rivers and watersheds and so on. Their main areas of activity are the Leslie Street Spit and Toronto Island. So if for example, the high water flooding that we saw in recent years becomes a problem and it needs to be managed better, it's the TRCA, Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, that's engaged on that task. So the Marine Use Strategy Report is partly describing things that happened in the past, and it's taking an inventory of existing infrastructure and surveying the current uses of the waterfront. It's partly analytical because it assesses how adequate that infrastructure is, and it identifies problem areas and unfulfilled needs. Partly it's forward-looking, so it's looking at trends, and it's describing future plans, and it's partly prescriptive. That is, it's making suggestions for how to fix problem areas and suggestions for plans and initiatives in the waterfront. The Marine Use Study Report, as I say here, as far as I can tell, isn't a commitment to fulfilling specific plans or descriptions of how those plans will be implemented, because in many cases, the plans are going to be implemented by the other groups, maybe not by Waterfront Toronto at all, but maybe by the Port Authority or maybe by the city or TRCA. The Marine Use Strategy Report also has a different geographical scope than the 2006 report. The 2020 report is more closely focused. You can see it doesn't go down along the western beaches. It doesn't go actually even quite as far as Ashbridges Bay. And it focuses, you can see the central sort of circle there in that northeast corner of the inner harbor. So the primary focus is that inner harbor Parliament Slip in particular. The secondary study areas are the areas I just described. These reports, both the 2006 and the 2020 report, were created by with a lot of consultation with stakeholders and groups of interest, including business, the cruise line industry, industry in general, such as the cement and red paths and so on, residents of the area, the sailing, paddling, and rowing clubs, our particular group of interest, the tour boat operators, yacht clubs and marinas, the private marine passenger transport, and we're really talking about the water taxis, and preservation and conservation interest naturalist groups. And those interviews pointed out some common themes that were consolidated in the report. The need for a clearer and consolidated management of quay walls and slips. And that is to say, who owns them, who maintains and repairs them, what's going to happen, how they're going to be used. A big issue and a complicated issue for Toronto. Second thing is a need for wayfinding along the waterfront. Third is that a lack of public berthing space and transient docking facilities. If you've ever wanted to tie up along a wall in the inner harbor on the city side, you know that problem. That there is also no universal dock or ramp available for emergency response, insufficient storage space on the waterfront for privately owned small vessels. And they're talking here not of small sailboats so much, but the kayaks and canoes and so on. And accessibility to the waterfront, parking, deliveries, access for disabled people. How do you get from the city down to the waterfront safely? You know, do you have to cross Lakeshore Boulevard where there's no traffic light and all of those sorts of things? More recently, of course, high water levels are an issue, and also to make the waterfront attractive year round. You know, it's a great place in the summer. It's a lot less used and a lot less interesting to many people in the winter. And accessibility, waterfront accessibility in the Portlands area. At the moment, you know, the whole Portlands is really just a concrete wall. Sewage water outfalls affecting water quality. We still have that problem. The city's trying to work on that. A lack of boat maintenance facilities in the Toronto waterfront, and that relates a lot to the losses of things in the Portlands as some of those dockyards have closed and so on. People have to go much further afield now for boat maintenance. And there is also just that lack of public launches and marina space access for recreational boating, especially in the study area. They mention a need for a continuous waterfront. How do you get from one part of the waterfront to another? If you're not in a boat, if you're trying to walk along the shore, you know, how do you walk from Yonge and Queens Quay to, you know, Cherry Street and Unwin Avenue? It's not really a continuous waterfront in that sense. And then finally, these ideas related, I think, a lot to tourism. Toronto could do more to represent it or present itself as a waterfront city and destination. The report is structured on this idea of sort of three key streams of discussion: movement, mooring, and management. The movement section is, you know, how do we get from the land to the water? This idea, again, of the continuous waterfront, water-based public transportation. How do people get around on the water in the public use? The ferries to the island, the water taxis, and so on. And what kind of access to recreational facilities are on the waterfront? You know, especially in the last couple of years of COVID summers, you know, people have wanted to use waterfront parks much more than even in the past, but there is a great demand. How do they get to those places and how do they use them? The mooring section really relates to the boats. Where do the boats go and how do we support growth? That is looking at the dock walls, looking at docking facilities and storage facilities, and the operation of the city harbor as an industrial port. And then finally, the management. This is a complicated issue for the city of Toronto because there are many different agencies, many different owners, and so on. So it's very tricky to coordinate things when that's the case. That first section on movement I'll just skip through a little bit here to say it relates to creating more connections to more destinations. Continuous waterfront again, expanding water-based public transportation, and support for activities on the waterfront. And the waterfront transit, you can even think of as starting out as far to the west as Long Branch, when you look at the streetcar that runs, from Long Branch over to the Humber Loop, if you're familiar with that streetcar, and then it kind of leads into a next section of transit right of way that runs all the way over into the Exhibition Loop, and then you're onto another segment of transit that goes from, Bathurst Street and the Fleet Street connection over to Parliament Street and up to Union Station. And then finally, and it doesn't exist yet, but the idea of a streetcar link that goes from Union Station and Queens Quay out to the east and down into the Portlands. This would be a transit corridor that is existing now in bits and pieces. So in terms of the way people move along the waterfront, I think it's a little difficult to visualize some of these things, but they exist. The Outer Harbor Recreational Node is a future thing. That will be part of the Portlands development. The Queens Quay streetcar, you may have ridden on it. You've certainly seen it. And the Martin Goodman Trail runs now along Queens Quay. Part of Queens Quay was, of course, refurbished in recent years by Waterfront Toronto. And then the Bentway underneath the Gardiner Expressway is kind of a linear park, as what I think they call it, all relating to the waterfront and traffic along that central waterfront corridor. And then on the water, there's also movement. There are the waterfront parks, the existing waterfront parks, which we know well enough, and then the newer parks, Sugar Beach and HTO Park being a couple. There is the Waterfront Walk, and it says that the report points out that Waterfront Toronto has added 26 kilometers of walkable routes by the lake. As boaters, we were perhaps not walking along those routes as much as traveling on the water, but also those, if you walk along Queens Quay, you'll see the Simcoe and Spadina wave decks, for example, as well. And then the concept of connecting the city to the waterfront means that the waterfront planning needs to be coordinated with the downtown plan to look at corridors that go north and south. If you've tried, for example, to walk from Front Street in Spadina down to the water, you know that it's by no means an easy track. And then also there are the festival events and tall ships events and so on that happen, taking people out onto the water, and of course our area here, the yachting, sailing, and canoeing, and so on. Some of those access needs will be better met with the Villiers Island development that's happening in the Portlands. Then there's all that existing marine public transit, the island ferries, the airport ferries, and the water taxis. And the water taxis are kind of scattered right now because there are 4 departure points on the main side of the harbor, and they go to 6 island landing points. Waterfront Toronto is conducting a 3-year pilot with the idea of centralizing these locations somewhat. There's also future public marine transportation. These are longer term considerations talking about expanding water connections to more destinations across the waterfront. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. The water taxis haven't really changed a great deal in recent years, but they are, I guess, from our point of view, somewhat new on the water still. And then the island ferries, these have been in operation for a long time, and passenger numbers have fluctuated, but they're still in heavy demand. There is a ferry fleet replacement initiative underway, in fact, now funded, and there will be a couple of new ferries coming in probably the next couple of years. First will be one will be a passenger ferry and one will be a vehicular ferry. Those will be electrically powered too, so there's something happening there. And then the concept of commuter ferries. For example, commuter ferries running, say, from Humber Bay to downtown. This is a consideration, a concept. The airport ferry is as stable as the airport, whatever that means. But basically, it's not going to be going on a different track or running at a different frequency or carrying anything very different as far as passengers go. The next thing, though, is the permitted vehicle ferry. Permitted, not permitted ferry, but permitted vehicles, that is vehicles with permits to go over to the Toronto Islands. Right now, if you want to get a vehicle over to the island, there are two ways. One is you go on the Anguilla ferry from the Jack Layton ferry terminal over to Hanlon's Point. You've seen that ferry going back and forth. Or you go down Bathurst Key and you take the island ferry across. Those are how vehicles get to the island. And creating a ferry option that's different from those would eliminate a lot of the traffic near the existing ferry terminal, the Jack Layton ferry terminal, that is, and also divert traffic from Iron Quay, which is the road that goes as an extension of Bathurst Street down to the airport ferry. So to do that, the idea is that they would create some kind of a new permanent dock inside the shipping channel, and it would run over to Hanlon's Point. And we can talk a little bit more about that as we go. But the recommendations for movement in the report, then, they recommend considering a permitted vehicular ferry service, and that'll run across the harbor from east to west or west to east. Also to consolidate the water taxi docks. So instead of 4 sort of separate water taxi dock locations across the waterfront, to put them in one area. Also to create some idea of, they call it a C-bus system here, they call it a commuter system somewhere else. A feasibility study for introducing some kind of an aquatic, a marine public transit. And then finally, to look at the marine nodes that is based on studies related to the water taxi dock system and the C-bus system. So you create new nodes on the shore to be points for these different new ferry services. And you'll see in a map, it'll be a little bit clearer. The second broad area is talking about mooring in the portlands. And this is basically, you know, what are the boats? Where do you put them? A lot of this relates not to the boats that we are on so much as the cruise ships and so on. Not cruise ships, primarily we call them the party boats, but you know what I mean. And then also the smaller stand-up paddleboards, kayaks, and so on. Where do these boats go? Where do they fit? Particularly relating to docking and storage on the walls, tie-ups, and how they fit into the industrial port. So looking at coordinating as recommendations, that the Marine Coordination Committee would look at coordinating mooring issues across the waterfront, which really means coordinating the Toronto Port Authority, the city, and Waterfront Toronto as a creator of docking facilities. Next are the Marina Slips. And the idea is to some way increase Marina Slip capacity. I think that probably the most likely will be not in the Central Waterfront, but they are talking about Parliament Street Slip, Outer Harbor Marina, and then the other marinas and yacht clubs on the waterfront. And then some sort of a transient mooring facility, which is really a pilot project, is a concept. If you want to, as it says, kiss and sail, touch and go along the walls in the harbor. As far as the tour and charter boats go, how to deal with this industry, basically. Not too concerned really with the floating structures that aren't on the water, but the new Donmouth boating management facility, a lot of this relates to Parliament Street slip, and some of it relates to the Polson slip area. And then the third broad section of the report is that management section. Who does what and how. And it points out, it says here, Toronto's changing waterfront contains a number of moving parts, each managed by different partners. Numerous and sometimes overlapping jurisdictions, ownerships, and legacy agreements can often create confusion and delay. And we've seen this many times. If you look at that collapse sort of break wall that was at the north end of the Eastern Gap sticking up into the harbor, as it sort of sank down into the water and as the water levels rose, it was just a complete hazard. The Port Authority undertook to remove it, but didn't say that doing so was a statement of ownership, for example. They're not going to replace it. Anyway, it's looking at ways that maybe these different agencies and groups can coordinate better and operate more transparently. So the idea that there would be some kind of a marine coordination committee and assigning ownership and so on. And we'll look at maps in a little bit that sort of illustrate the problem and really make it clear. And again, looking at good state of repair programs for shoreline infrastructure. And related to that are safety stations, signage, etc. You know, are there ladders to climb out? Are there rescue systems? Or, you know, how is it all going to work? And how is it also in this stewardship and leadership side going to coordinate with First Nations, which is a larger discussion, I think, as well. I'll let you look at the report to go into that. There are numerous agencies and obviously the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council and so on. Those considerations need to be fitted in with the City of Toronto. The abbreviation here, COT, is City of Toronto. I hate TLAs that don't explain themselves. TLA meaning three-letter acronym. So there are some maps. There are 4 major maps in the report. And the best way to look at these maps is to get that PDF and open it up and zoom in, because there's an enormous amount of detail that you can't see any other way. But one is looking at the marine use inventory. One is looking at who owns what on the water's edge. And then there are 2 transportation maps, the existing and the future. So this is a sort of top view of the marine use inventory map. And you can't really see anything here except a microscopic legend and a microscopic table of contents over on the right and some lines drawn. But we can zoom in and I'll show you a little bit as examples. So this is that legend that you saw back over on the bottom left. That legend is identifying the marine assets and uses and routes, where the ferries run, where industrial ships run, private craft, tour, charter boats, and water taxis in particular. And then, of course, you also have railways and roads and streetcars. So zooming in on one little area, for example, in the central waterfront, this is a screenshot taken out of the map here. So you can see that this tiny little area right here, when you zoom in on the map, is actually showing a lot of boat routes and numbers. Each one of these boats, say number 65 here, is identified with an actual tour boat. because these tour boats do have their official locations along the break of the city walls and so on. Of course, these three red lines coming in are the primary ferry routes for the city ferries, going over to Hanlon's Point, Ward's Island, and Center Island. And then you have the Trillium and so on. And you have the Yonge Street slip, where we saw that photograph of a giant pike. It's still amazing to me that you can pull that fish out of the water just feet away from, you know, the busiest ferry dock in the city, in the country, probably. And then, so if you were to take a look, just go back here, take a look at boat number 65. What is that boat? The legend will show you that number 65 is the Kayama, that big tall shippy sort of thing. So you have the ferries, you have the industrial boats, and included in this, interestingly, is the Maple City and Windmill Point. These two used to be the Island Airport ferries before the new ones. So they are stuck in the Keating Cut, and they've been tied to the wall there for now probably getting on for 20 years. Anyway. Oh, and the Windmill Point. Yeah, okay. So anyway, those are the industrial ships in the harbor. Here are some more. A lot of them are related to Lafarge and carriers and ships that are carrying bulk cargoes. But also you have some things for like the Toronto Brigantine and so on. You can find all of these locations on the map to see where these things are. Private craft also. Here you have the Playfair and Pathfinder and the Hiawatha and Quasend, among others, Island Yacht Club tender. And then something like 30 tour charter boats here. Some of these we will recognize by name. And the water taxis. These are the water taxi companies that are in operation right now. Finally, the report is identifying private craft mooring. And what we're talking about here is boats that we know of as boats on mooring balls. So Toronto Hydroplane and Sailing Club has got some in the Ashbridges Bay, as does Ashbridges Bay. Then there are anchorages on the Ward Island Beach and Hanlon's Point Beach. These are informal anchorages offshore, off the beaches, that happen in the summer primarily. The multi-hull swing moorings is the Toronto Multi-Hull Cruising Club in the Outer Harbor, and the seasonal pleasure craft swing moorings. There are two of them. Olympic Island. These are the RCYC swing moorings off their shore, and seasonal pleasure craft swing moorings south of Coronation Park. That's the National Yacht Club mooring basin, just near the C&E entranceway. So here's another map, and again, this is the Water's Edge ownership map. Who owns what? And I'll do the same thing. First, go in and take a look at the legend. Here are the things and who could be owning them as far as dock walls. The City of Toronto, Create TO, Ports Toronto, it could be privately owned, provincially owned, unknown. Waterfront Toronto, and then there are some future shorelines. And then there are also sort of hybrid ownerships. So something that's owned by Ports Toronto, but is leased or owned by the Toronto Port Authority, leased to the City of Toronto. And then something here that is leased to the Toronto Port Authority by the province. So all of these sorts of things, you can read the fine print, but one of the interesting things here is that there are unknown ownership areas.
Yeah.
You wonder where are the unknown ownership areas? Okay, well, let's start here. This is the Yonge Street slip again. So I zoomed in here before. That Yonge Street slip, I think the water's owned by giant predatory fish that we didn't know were there. But but in addition, you can see that the city owns some some is leased to Waterfront Toronto, some is leased to the City of Toronto, some is leased to Waterfront Toronto long-term, some is leased to the City of Toronto long-term, some is short-term. That piece of wall has got 4 separate leases on it right there.
Jeez.
Captain John's is not there. Then you've got another piece of ownership across the top of that slip, another piece of ownership down the side, and then around in here. So you've got, what is that? Seven different ownerships in that one slip. So how do you ever get anything done? That's one of the biggest issues, and that's what this report is really all about, is trying to solve. Here's another area. This is now the northeast corner. This is the Parliament Street slip, and Waterfront Toronto's got big plans for this area, but you'll notice actually this little strip of yellow here, and we've talked about this before. That's RCYC right there. That's a piece of RCYC ownership right there. There isn't a lot of private ownership in the harbor wall. If you go through this map, you'll see there's very little. There is also this piece here, which is associated with what used to be a grain elevator here. But there are, again, lease arrangements on top of various layers of ownership or levels of ownership. I guess not layers until it's a lease. Here's the National Yacht Club. So the Western Gap, this water is owned one way. The wall is owned another way to here. And then when you walk along what National Yacht Club calls D-Dock here, you've got this bit of wall. But this corner, National Yacht Club members will remember that collapsing and National having to work rather hard and fight a group of agencies and city groups saying it's not ours to fix. This gray area from here around to here is identified as unknown ownership. And who wants to own it? This is a break wall that was put in 1910. Who wants to own it today? You know, owning a piece of dock wall in the inner harbor is great because you can tie a cruise ship up to it or a tour boat, and you can collect revenue from it. Mm-hmm. This is only expense for whoever's going to own it. And if you've paid any attention or been around National Yacht Club, particularly this section of wall here is just crumbling now. So that's what unknown represents. Unknown is really nobody wants it, not anything else. One day it'll be sorted out perhaps by historians and sea lawyers or whatever is required. Then we'll talk about the public transportation map. This should be familiar to most of us. You know, you've got the RCYC tenders running out over to the RCYC here. You've got the island ferries running to their 3 points like that. You've got the IYC ferry running around over to IYC here, and so on. These are the groups involved, the ferries that we know and the water taxis that we maybe know less of, but they're there. The water taxi locations are identified here as 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then there are purple locations for landing the water taxis over on the island. And oops. This is just that area in a little bit more detail. And then the future shows new lines. What you're starting to see now are lines running out of this slip and over to Ontario Place. This is a future concept out of what's called the Portland slip. That doesn't exist, M1, M2, but it might exist. Similarly, this V1 over to V2, this is the permitted vehicle ferry that we were talking about earlier. This is how you might get, for example, fuel shipments over to the airport. Right now, it's a double tanker truck that comes down through Bathurst Key and takes the island ferry over and then drives across the runways of the airport, hoping that planes are not wanting to use them at the same time, down to the fuel depot down here. So this would be some kind of a vehicular ferry that would run back and forth this way. And then there are some other new nodes in the whole sort of future ferries picture here. M3, M4, M5, we'll look at it a little closer, but those are going to be some kind of ferry points that are in the Villiers Island area. And then the concept, again, these are future concepts. M6 around to M5 would be some kind of a ferry to the outer harbor and to points along the south side of the island here. So let's take a look. These, the Ontario Place, the Portland Slip, the corner of Parliament Street Slip, Keating Channel, Canoe Cove. Where's Canoe Cove? You'll see in a minute. Outer Harbor Marina, Wards Island Beach, and Manitou Beach. Manitou Beach being that south beach on the south end of the island, getting out towards Gibraltar. These are proposed ideas around Villiers Island, integrating those with the other ferry routes. And then finally, there are items for further consideration. The report doesn't deal with them in detail, and I think given the time that I have, I won't deal with them in detail either. But they're here and they're highlighted. You can get this from the Shellback's website once I put it up there. And but it's looking at navigation and things like that, ice breaking, coordinating vessel movements, water levels, and so on. I'm going to flip through pages to get us to the end right there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up the final report. This is the report itself. And just to give you a vision of the maps that we're talking about, because really I think they're, in a way, the biggest amount of effort that was put into this whole report is creating these maps. So this is the marine use inventory map. And the thing is, you can just keep on zooming in and zooming in and zooming in to see exactly what's going on in a particular part of the port and harbor. So who's using this piece of harbor, or who's using this piece of harbor? There's a great deal of detail. It's a good way to get familiar with what's there in the port and harbor. This is Bathurst Key. There's the Billy Bishop Island Ferry, Ireland Park, Portland Slip, and the boats that dock in there. So these are some of the tour boats. There are 5 tour boats in that area. I think number 44 might not be a tour boat. It might actually be that large tugboat. And to look at the granularity of this, I mean, you can find individual dwellings on Algonquin Island, or over here on Wards. Pretty much, it's pretty comprehensive, and it's really worth actually digging into and taking a look at. You know, the specific clubs of the outer harbor and their clubhouses and their lawnmower sheds. Anyway, that's an overview of the report. I hope you found that interesting.
Amazing.
Yeah, so now it can move to the question period, and just follow the instructions how to raise your virtual hand and to unmute yourself. I'll stop sharing in case Ron wants to refer to any part of the report that's in his answers. The other thing, did I hear you correctly? You're going to post a link to the report on the Shellback's website?
Well, I'll probably, I mean, this recording will be there, and I'll probably put links to there's the report, there's a summary of the report, there's sort of a backgrounder to the report. There's several different documents, and I'll put the links to those so that people can find them pretty easily. Or Diane could send them out in an email too.
Maybe both, Ron.
Yeah.
So our first question is from Shane. Go ahead, unmute yourself and ask your question or comment.
Yeah.
Hi, Shane.
Was there no expansion on the residents that live on the islands? It's always been a contentious issue.
Yeah, it didn't really deal with the island residents population. What were you thinking it would cover?
Well, there's been a bit of a tug of war about their leasing arrangements and future development, or their right to remain on the island. So,
Right. At the moment, those people are on long-term leases.
bit of a
And
hot potato, they didn't want to touch it.
I'm sorry?
Was it a bit of a hot potato? They didn't want to go back there?
I don't think that it's probably in the jurisdiction of the bodies writing the report.
So Iran, can isn't there another Toronto Island master plan being developed, which might deal with that issue, which is
Yes.
separate and distinct from the waterfront master plan?
Yes, none of this is dealing with what we can call parks, because there is the whole park structure. The city's got a large park structure with literally hundreds of parks, and the Toronto Islands in general are managed under the parks rather than the Waterfront Secretariat, separate branches of city administration.
Thank you.
Okay, I have another question, Ron. Did they talk, were there anything in the report about where the money would come from all of this to do it? Because one thing I noticed, like if they have a dedicated vehicle ferry, that might cost a lot more money to operate, especially in the winter, because right now the city takes passengers and vehicles in the winter on the Angara. So they might force them to run two ferries. So was there any look at the expenses of all this?
They were not breaking down expenses, and you have to think that vehicular traffic over to the islands now is actually handled by two separate groups. The vehicular traffic to the airport and some vehicular traffic to the water treatment plant goes on the Toronto Island Ferry. I've seen fluoridation vehicles going across to the island treatment plant on the airport ferry, as well as the the vehicles that go to the airport and the fuel deliveries. And then the city runs the Angara, which takes other vehicles over for all the rest of the use of the airport. How that would be handled, whether it would be offloading or a complete group, I don't know. And it ties in also to the ice clearing, right? The ice breaking capabilities, because the report points out that there are three different groups that break ice in the harbor. That is the Metro Police, the Marine Unit, the Port Authority with the Island Ferry, and then the City of Toronto with its fire department ferry, the William Lyon Mackenzie. So I think that really that's part of the coordination effort, that management section 3 of the report. It doesn't go into who's going to pay for that.
Okay, yeah, are there any other questions or comments that people have? Please raise your virtual hand. If not, I'll get one more call out. Yeah, Diane, go ahead, Diane.
I just want to thank you, Ron, for going through all of that incredible detail. And one doesn't have to wonder really why things seem to slow down to a crawl because of that whole management issue. When there's so many different parties involved, never mind the federal, provincial, and city, but also the different ownerships. I think it's exciting, some of the things that they're proposing, and I would love to see it happen, but I'm not sure how soon in my
Well,
life. I might not even see it in my life.
I pointed out by looking at the 2006 report that a lot of things that seemed in view in 2006 still haven't happened 15 years later. So, you know,
Exactly.
when you see the political hand pulling strings, then suddenly, you know, an election happens and there's a different government in power, and things change again.
An election happens at any particular level. And
Well, we're going to see a provincial election in a few months, you know.
in a few months. And this morning, the polls are saying that Ford is going to win again. So
Right.
we'll see how that goes. If there are no other questions, I just want to say thank you again. And you're saying that you're going to put the links up to the report on the web?
Yeah. I put links into the last page. Actually, I didn't show the page of my presentation.
Okay.
But I will put them, oh, they'll be available. There's really only sort of one link that matters, and that's the Waterfront Toronto Marine Use Strategy page that describes the different reports and so on, and has links to them all. So,
and that would include the maps.
The maps are inside the report itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, because that, to me, that gives me more clarity than anything if I can take a look at the maps. I don't know how everybody else feels, but I like to be able to get that visual to have some sense of, you know, an overall picture of what's going on.
Yeah, I think that the maps are the most sort of tangible part of the report. And when you look at the issues that are being described in the report, and then you match them up to the representation on the map of, you know, so when you talk in abstract terms about the water taxis and that they should all be coming into a single dock, that is a lot clearer when you look at a map and see where they come into now. When you walk along Queens Quay, you'll see a water taxi dock here, and you'll see another one a few feet along, and then you go a half a kilometer and there's another one. You know, you can see the problem.
I mean, that's all well and good for people who are totally familiar with them and know to which dock to go in order to get one to go to Algonquin Island or to Wards Island or whichever place you wanted to go. But if you're not familiar with it.
I mean, I think most of us are probably not, because we've been getting to the island other ways for our lives, right?
And I'm only familiar with it because I have a son who lives on Algonquin, and he takes the ferry because he works in the theater. He's often taking the water taxi because the ferries aren't running at the time that he's going home.
Right.
You know, so yes, that certainly is one aspect.
The report doesn't talk about another ferry idea that has been sitting in physical form on the waterfront. A ferry that was brought up from Halifax and is docked, a big blue ferry that is owned by interests connected to Centerville over on the island.
Oh.
You might have seen that ferry sitting there. It's sort of near where the William Lyon Mackenzie docks, the fire department. I can't remember.
Oh, really? That far west?
Yeah, that's where it's tied up right now. It doesn't, I think the plan got stalled because they brought the ferry from Halifax, with the idea of using it, but they didn't have a landing destination on the islands, and
Okay.
so they're into the red tape again.
Yeah. Yeah. Jeez. Wow. Okay, well, I'd like everybody just to give Ron another round of applause for his exceptional work. You really can and do dig through some of these things for us, and we certainly appreciate it.
I think it's useful to know about these reports and the planning process, even if the plans are unfulfilled. It's very good to get a feel for what's being discussed and where things might go, because otherwise you could end up blindsided, you know?
No question.
Yeah.
You're 100% right there. So thank you for giving us clarity through your lens, even though if you were to read it yourself, it might not come as clear as the way you've done it for us this morning. So once again, thank you so much. We do appreciate it.